Hai ati awa, puti tua, puti waho, o te pakiaka o te rākau, o maere nuku, o maere raki, o maere o te marawhenua. I roka tāne, I rāro tāne, te raki ihi a tāne, o pakapako a tāne, muhoka no te araki, o atu e tāne ki uta, o tuturu o whiti whakamaua ki a tina, haumi e hui e tai ki e.
Kia ora, Brendan, for the karakia. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our fourth session of Changing Tides, Tai Tōrua, the web series designed to take a deep look at the issues surrounding our moana, the ocean. Thank you for making time to be a part of this panel discussion. To those of you joining us for the first time, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And those of you who have been to any of our previous sessions, I think you'll all agree it's been quite a journey, giving us all a lot to think about.
I am your host, Elisabeth Easther. And like many of you, I've seen huge changes to the marine environment in my lifetime. And as a journalist, I'm always looking for ways to educate myself about what is happening in the ocean, what humans are doing to it, and ultimately to look at ways of finding ways to help protect the moana so it may flourish. Tai Tōrua is brought to you by WWF-New Zealand and Te Papa Atawhai, the Department of Conservation. Thank you to those organisations for making this series possible, and to the team behind the scenes who do incredibly clever things, as you might just have noticed, to ensure that everything runs smoothly. And a heartfelt thank you to our panellists today, Dr. Nick Shears from the University of Auckland, Brendan Flack from Kāti Huirapa, and Samara Nicholas from the Mountains to the Sea Conservation Trust. But before I hand to our first speaker, a few housekeeping matters. There is a chat window that will be open for the next 10 minutes. If you're having any problems, technical or otherwise, do please use that and one of our behind-the-scenes people will sort it out for you. Q&A. There is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, click on that, a box will pop up, type in your question, although they will be filtered to avoid duplication and any that are off-topic will be removed. Bearing in mind that we have just 1 hour, we may not get to answer every question, but you can also email marine@doc.gov.nz. Voting. If a question that you wanted to ask comes up on the Q&A, stick a thumbs up on it and it will rise to the top of the heap. And we will try to answer the ones with the most votes first. This session is being recorded and we will be putting them all on YouTube on the WWF New Zealand channel. And it will join all the other talks so that if you haven't seen this or you know someone who wished they'd been here, you can share that with them. And People's Choice. On another note, we have quite an exciting announcement to make. We're offering an 8th session of this series to be held in July called People's Choice. Is there an ocean topic you would like to learn more about or a speaker you would like to hear from? Let us know by sending an email to marine@doc.gov.nz and all suggestions are welcome. And finally, our kaupapa, our guiding philosophy, is very simple. Whatever you say today in your comments or questions, please be respectful. Today, you have joined us for our 4th webinar, Marine Protection in Aotearoa, which sees us return to the original format of the first 2 weeks. We will begin with each of our 3 speakers giving a short talk, after which the floor will be opened for questions from you. The focus today, what is a marine protected area and why are they important for New Zealand? An estimated 30% of Aotearoa, New Zealand's biodiversity is in the sea, and along our 15,000 kilometres of coastline, more than 17,000 marine species have been recorded. We have rights over one of the largest areas of ocean in the world, and with these rights come responsibilities. And while some progress has been made, our marine environment is under threat, but there is so much more we can do to ensure our biodiversity is protected for its own sake and for future generations. Currently, just 0.4% of our coastal waters are in highly protected areas, while the recommended proportion is 30%. So we have a long way to go. One of last week's speakers, Carl Waugh, sent us an email, and he finished with this comment. It is a privilege to help the cause of our most significant ecosystem. 2 out of 3 breaths I take each day is oxygen made in the oceans. I'm very keen to see us as a society stay completely focused on helping each other help our oceans. Now to our speakers. I'd like to introduce first of all Dr. Nick Shears, Associate Professor at the University of Auckland's Institute of Marine Science. With over 2 decades undertaking ecological research on rocky reefs around the world, Nick focuses on the importance of those ecosystems and how they're impacted by human activities, including fishing, sedimentation, and climate change. Nick grew up at Whangaparoa snorkeling, fishing, sailing, surfing and exploring in the Hauraki Gulf, and he declares himself fortunate to now have a career that allows him to continue studying and exploring the waters of Tikapa Moana. He now spends his weekends sharing his passion for the ocean with his 3 daughters and tells me one common family discussion, had while fishing, is how to strike a better balance that allows us to keep catching fish and eating them, but also protect the marine environment. And one day, while out fishing at Hauturu, Little Barrier, Nick's 8-year-old asked, why don't we have half for fishing and half protected? And maybe we can come to that question later. Kia ora, Nick.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you, Elisabeth, for the nice introduction. I'll just share my screen. So I'm going to be talking to you all today a little bit about the research and what we've learned from marine protection in Aotearoa. And I have to be a little disclaimer there. My research, I've only got 12 minutes, so I'm going to focus on work largely in the northern part of New Zealand where I've most of my research has been carried out. So first of all, I'd just like to talk briefly about the types of marine protected areas that we have in New Zealand. So first of all, zooming out to a larger spatial scale, you can see our EEZ there in the light blue, with a number of different sorts of marine protected areas. There's the seamount closures in green, and also benthic protection areas there, which offer differing levels of protection. As we move into our coastal environment, on the right, you can see we have some large marine mammal sanctuaries, which limit the certain types of fishing that are potentially risky for our marine mammals. And obviously we want to minimize them getting caught, particularly for the hectors and Maui's dolphins. So as we come more into our coastal waters is where we encounter our marine reserves. So our marine reserves are our highest level of protection. They're completely no-take, meaning there's no fishing at all within those areas. And we've got 44 marine reserves in New Zealand, and you can see the large ones are primarily at the offshore islands, such as at the sub-Antarctics and the Kermadec Islands. And if you look around our mainland coast, while we're doing well in terms of having quite a high number of marine reserves, it only covers a very small fraction, less than 1% of our coastal waters. Nevertheless, those areas, and as I'll talk about, have been really important in terms of understanding the impacts of fishing and how those can be reversed through protection. Now, on the right there, we've got a range of different types of other sorts of marine protected areas, so referred to as Type 2 marine protected areas by Department of Conservation. And they include things like marine parks, like we have up here at Mimi Whangata, as well as cable protection zones, different sorts of fisheries closures, and I think in Mataitai. What these maps don't encompass is our more customary or traditionally protected areas like Rahui and Taupuri, which Brendan will be talking to us a little bit more about later. Now, my research has focusing on rocky reef ecosystems and understanding the impacts of fishing has naturally gravitated towards marine reserves because they stop fishing. So a lot of you will know that our first marine reserve was established in 1977 up north of Auckland, the Cape Rodney to Okakari Point, or Lee Marine Reserve. Now this is about an hour's drive north of Auckland, but I think when it was established it was probably about a 3-hour drive along a windy track. But even then, in the prior to the reserve being established in the 70s, it was a very popular fishing location. So that was protected in 1977. It's about a 5-kilometre stretch of coast. It extends 800 metres offshore. And this was set up for scientific purposes. This is the Lee Marine Laboratory, which is the University of Auckland's research station. And the scientists basically wanted areas where they could undertake their research without the concern of fishing. They weren't really necessarily interested in the impacts of fishing or trying to study the impact of fishing. It was more of a, let's just have an area where we can do our research that's not being fished. Little did they know, how important these areas were going to become in terms of research and understanding how fishing impacts on our coastal environment. So this is, how do we use these reserves as to understand the impacts of fishing? So you've stopped fishing within a particular area of coast, and so what we do is we set up a bunch of sites and survey sites within the marine reserve that are representative of that particular reserve, and then survey sites on the surrounding coast. So that gives us quite a good picture of, you know, how the reefs in the reserve or ecosystems in the reserve compare to outside. Now I'm showing you these 4 different reserves here in northeastern New Zealand because they're reasonable sized reserves. They're found on our exposed coasts, and they've all been protected for 20 or more years, up to 40 odd years. And these have also been a focus of a lot of the research and monitoring that we do. And as they are rocky, they all have a lot of rocky reef inside them, and so they harbour a lot of the species that we're really interested in, especially from we like to catch and eat, like snapper and crayfish. And so a lot of the monitoring is focused on things like snapper and crayfish, as well as the kelp forest or sea urchin barren habitats that are found within those reserves. You'll just notice here that the Poor Knights Island is completely encompassed within a marine reserve. So in order to compare to this site, we also sample at the Mokohinau Islands, which are reasonably nearby. We recognise there's probably natural inherent differences between these locations, but it's sort of the best we can do. And we're interested in how these areas change relatively over time following protection. Now, so I just want to talk very quickly about some of our recent monitoring results. So these reserves have been monitored for the last 20 odd years quite intensively, and that's funded primarily by the Department of Conservation. So one of the big species of interest is snapper or tamuri, which is a really important species from a cultural, recreational and commercial perspective. Over 2,000 tonnes of snapper are taken from the Hauraki Gulf every year by recreational fishermen, and a similar amount by commercial fishermen. So it's a really important target species. And throughout history, it has shown the sort of typical decline, but then with quota management, things have levelled off. And this fishery is considered to be around its soft limit, or just under 20% of its unfished biomass. The target for this fishery is around 40%. So we've still got a way to go to get it back up there. So how has this species responded to protection? If anyone's been to one of the marine reserves in northern New Zealand, it's pretty obvious. The snapper are abundant, they're big, and so that ultimately means their biomass is much higher than the surrounding fishery. So the fished areas are thought to be about 20% of their unfished biomass. So if we look at what these biomasses are, so this is the biomass outside of the reserves in the surrounding coast, you can see it ranges from 5 to up to 19%. So probably potentially lower than what the fisheries estimates are. But the big thing and where these reserves are really important is they're protecting the large individuals. So if you look at the fished, so these are based on diver survey results. So it's not necessarily the best method. We use other video methods as well that yield similar results for snapper. But what you can see here, this is the size of the snapper. The dotted line is the legal size limit of 30 centimetres. You see very few individuals outside the reserves in that size class. Whereas if you look inside the reserves, you see lots of these big individuals. And it's protecting these individuals that is really important, because they're an important part of the ecosystem. They're big predators. They eat sea urchins or kinna, but they also produce a lot of larvae. So these are your breeders in the population. So one snapper like this, which is say about 70 centimetres, produces the same number of larvae as about 36 snapper that are just on that legal size limit. So these large snapper produce a disproportionate amount of larvae. So this means that these reserves produce up to 18 times more eggs per unit area than in fished areas. So it's kind of long been a discussion around how does that then contribute to the surrounding fishery, all of these extra eggs. And so some recent work, not that recent now, work that's been done over the last 10 years has shown how larvae that are spawned, or snapper that spawn in the reserves, their eggs spill out onto the surrounding coast and actually stayed within the surrounding waters. They weren't dispersed offshore by, or too far offshore by currents. And then that's now been supported by some genetic analysis, which shows that about 11% of the snapper that have been caught, juvenile snapper within this area, actually have parents from the marine reserve at Lee. So it was quite striking, really, that even a relatively small marine reserve could be contributing to the surrounding fishery. Now, crayfish, a lot of people within New Zealand would have heard about the Cray2 fishery, which is our local fishery in northern New Zealand, northeastern New Zealand, being in pretty bad shape. It's just gone through a range of quota cuts. And this stock is also considered to be around or just below that soft limit of around 20%. It shows very much the same patterns as snapper, if not, even being in a worse state. So this is just an example from the different reserves of, this is the fish population outside the reserve. And you can see in the reserve, you've got a much more natural looking size structure with lots of big individuals. And for things like crayfish, it's those big individuals that are really important from an ecological perspective and also from a mating and spawning perspective. This is a large male crayfish standing outside his den where he'll have multiple females that he's able to mate with, and they can then produce large amounts of eggs. So same sort of thing. These reserves are very effective at protecting these large individuals. Now, I've alluded to these sort of ecosystem effects, and that's one of the big changes that we've seen within the Lee Marine Reserve following protection. I forgot to set my timer. Okay. So this is the Marine Reserve, an aerial image in 1975. And you can see all these light coloured reefs. And so what those reefs all were, they were all covered in kinna in the 70s. And you can remember from the start the photo of the snapper. So this area by the 70s had been heavily fished. But what's happened following the protection in 1977 was the recovery of snapper and crayfish that has led to the recovery of these kelp forests. So you can now see from satellite imagery the extensive kelp forests within the reserve. Now, this was first recorded in the early 2000s, and there was a lot of debate and question over whether this sort of pattern played out over larger areas, or was this just something specific to Lee? What we've seen now is that it does occur in marine reserves throughout northeastern New Zealand, these same sort of changes. So this is just some mapping work that was done by Caitlin Lawrence. This is it's part of her master's. This is the Lee Reserve in 1977, and the pink area is all the urchin barrens or kinna barren habitat. And then this is her map now, where there's now very small amounts of kinna barrens left within the reserve at Lee. Now, if we compare this to other marine parks, so this is Mimiwhangata Marine Park, which was also mapped in the 70s, but it allows recreational fishing. So it's kind of a fishing park. There's just no commercial fishing there. When this area was mapped in the 70s, there was relatively small amounts of kinna barren there then, compared to at least at Lee. But when Caitlin mapped this last year, you can see over a third of those shallow reefs is all dominated by kinna. So it's gone in the opposite direction to the Marine Reserve at Lee. The Mokohinau Islands are fully fished. They were also mapped in the 70s, which allowed us to now remap them in last year. And you can see again, with the Mokohinau's, the amount of kinna barrens has increased there as well. So what we're seeing around lots of our coast and lots of areas in the Hauraki Gulf and northeastern New Zealand are these extensive kinna barrens. But within our marine protected areas, these long established no-take reserves, we see that the amount of kinna barrens is either non-existent or very low compared to the surrounding coast. So while this is a very clear effect in northeastern New Zealand, it is worth pointing out that these kinna barrens aren't necessarily a problem throughout the whole country. There are, localized areas where kinna barrens occur. But we have seen that through protection, we can restore the kelp forests to these barrens. So just to wrap up, as far as marine protected areas go and what we've learned, I think it's very clear that no-take marine protected areas are effective in allowing the recovery of exploited species and ecosystems within their boundaries if they're designed appropriately. They have a clear scientific value, obviously. If we're trying to understand the impacts of fishing or the status of stocks, they provide an important reference point or baseline really of an unfished population. And even with reserves at Lee, Tawhranui, which aren't very big, these have had quite a substantial value from that perspective. And they obviously have a conservation and fisheries value as well, not just from the point of view of providing a reference point, but also demonstrating that it is a mechanism that can be used to allow ecosystems to restore and to protect harvested species, such as protecting these large individuals, which can be important broodstock. But the values that we derive from marine protected areas, or the benefits, I guess you might say, is dependent on the goals that you have to start with when you're establishing a marine protected area, and then how you design it. What fishing is going to be excluded, how long is it going to be protected. What I've shown you is the result of what happens when you stop all forms of fishing and over a long time period. And a lot of these ecological changes do take a long time to occur. Think of a large snapper, it is going to take a long time to grow. And it's important, if we are wanting to restore ecosystems and allow these systems to recover, they do need to be effective at protecting those harvested species that drive these changes. So they need to take into account edge effects, so that we're things like crayfish, for example, close to a reserve boundary are likely to get caught because they venture across the boundary. And the boundaries need to be far enough offshore to encompass those movements of the adults when they move out onto the sand, for example. But there's a fairly good understanding of how from this research, how to protect these ecosystems and how to protect these species. So final point is that I'm not just talking about marine reserves. I think we're all aware now and can see that there's lots of different mechanisms and more mechanisms for protection, whether it's cultural tools, rahui, taipuri, or through the Resource Management Act, we can see that we can hopefully get some of these conservation and fisheries science values using other mechanisms rather than just the Marine Reserves Act. And I can't do a talk on marine protected areas in Aotearoa without mentioning these three gentlemen, Bill Ballantyne, Roger Grace and Wade Doak, who I guess are the three grandfathers of marine protection in New Zealand. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Nick. That was wonderful. And thank you too for bringing to mind the wonderful work of Bill, Roger and Wade. That is something for all of us to remember and perhaps try and be like them. Now, our second speaker today is Brendan Flack, who comes to us from Otago. And just before we started, he took us for a quick look around the beach that is right on the doorstep of his home, which was quite amazing, although he does need a very thick wetsuit to go surfing, I'm told. So Brendan Flack is tangata tiaki for Kāti Huirapa. He is also the researcher and current chair of the Committee of the East Otago Taiapuri, a customary fisheries protection area established in 1999. Brendan has always been a keen surfer with that thick wetsuit and is also known to enjoy all the foods of the sea. As an adult, Brendan was introduced to the world of traditional Polynesian sailing vessels, and it's changed the way he views the ocean. Brendan also has a particular passion for helping young people understand the world that lies above and below the horizon. Kia ora, Brendan.
Kia ora. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that kind introduction. Ko waiau, ko hikaroro o te mauka, ko waikawaiti te awa, ko puketaraki te marae, ko Kaiterua heke te hapu, ko Brendan toku ingoa, no reira, tēnā tātou katoa. My talk today is on, sorry, I'm just setting my timer. My talk today is on inherited stewardship. So I'm just going to share, I hope I'm going to share my slide with you people, and I may or may not have done that. And I think, in fact, I haven't done that. The talk is around kaitiakitanga and mahika kai, so that inherited stewardship in a changing world. I'm really not sure if I have this. Yes, here we go now. I'm hoping that you can see this. Yep. So mahika kai is that cultural connection to our tupuna, that relationship of the gathering of food that connects the people who live currently and connects them to the works of their ancestors. Now, many of those species that we have now, I guess, turned into, many of them are extinct, and many of them are in the classification of endangered or threatened species. So the work of Tangata Tiaki is to increase the environment to allow the gathering once again of these special creatures, if you like, and return them back to the menu. We have particularly six principles of kaitiakitanga. The kaitiakitanga, these principles are around rahui, and Nick, thank you for mentioning rahui. Rahui is essentially restriction, restricting not only technology, but in a modern world, it is temporary closures, bag limits, fisheries legislation. And Modi is the health of entire ecosystems, and man has the ability to degrade or enhance the Modi of ecosystems, of catchment areas, species, individuals. One of the other principles of kaitiakitanga is utu. That is the reciprocity. It is giving back. It is conservation. It is particularly riparian planting in a modern world, habitat restoration, reseeding of shellfish, the removal of pest species. For instance, one of the pest species that we have in our taiapiri is the Undaria pinifida. So Undaria is a invasive seaweed that arrived in this country about 30 years ago. We've got a program now where we are looking to eradicate or at least control the spread of the Undaria. The other principles of kaitiakitanga are ranginui, papatua nuku, and takaroa. Now these atua, these Māori gods, if you like, are our Māori way of understanding the modern world, the environmental world. So when we understand these atua, our ancestors, ranginui, papatua nuku, and takaroa, we get to understand the relationship that these atua have. We begin to understand at least a little in terms of sea level rise, ocean acidification, climate change, sedimentation, runoff, all these land-based activities and changes to the environment. So in around 2002, the East Otago Taiapiri finally began to have was able to create a management committee. So our ancestors, or our tupuna, our elders of Kāti Huirapa, it took them 10 years of hard work to create the Easter Tago Taiapiri. 2002, we were finally able to establish a working committee, but our ancestors at that time had decided also to include the community into that into this management system, and in doing so, it was 5 years later that our first regulation was installed, and that was a set net ban. It was created after a lot of work, a lot of consultation, and eventually this set net ban was the first regulation that our Easter Tago Taiapiri was able to establish. We moved forward to 2008, and the first regulation around reduced bag limits was created. 2010, there was a reduction in the bag limits for wet fish, so reducing them from 30 down to 10 for a recreational take. Pawas was reduced from a recreational take of 10 down to 5. This taiapiri took 10 years to establish, but then we fast forward to about 2015, and our mātaitai, freshwater mātaitai on the Waikaiti River was established. It was established, and it took 9 months only to for the creation of our freshwater mātaitai. That was, I think, a change in terms of society from those early 1990s when I guess a mistrust was formed around Indigenous management of customary areas. Now, 2015, the community had gained the trust, I guess, to be able to manage, or at least show to be able to manage a freshwater mātaitai on the Waikaiti River. That mātaitai essentially led to a project called He Pātaka Waiora, and now He Pātaka Waiora is ko Hikaroro te Mauka, so the mountain, the catchment. He Pātaka Waiora will once again become a healthy food store. Now, the research that goes on in our taiapiri, we take water samples, we connect with landowners so that we can gain access to some of the areas that we've been excluded from for many years. And this He Pātaka Waiora is now formed a part of a 200-year restoration plan for the restoration of the habitat of the Waikaiti awa that flows into the Karitane catchment area and into the Easter Tago Taiapiri. Now, the Taiapiri is a coastal area that's 22 kilometres in length and encompasses 4 estuarine areas. Now, I think I may have mucked up some of my slides there, whānau. I'm hoping that you were able to get an idea of what I was speaking about, but I did have a plan B. If I had technical difficulties, I've created this wonderful, a piece of art really, and I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is a picture of a human being. Now, I guess in terms of the difference between a customary protected area and a marine protected area is that human beings are part of that ecosystem, and marine protection essentially is a byproduct of customary protection. Now, quickly, I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to quickly talk about some highs and lows of customary fisheries management. Once again, a bit of high tech, but in no particular order, and in or apart from chronological order. As I mentioned, 10 years to establish the taiapiti, 9 months those years later to establish the Waikuaiti Mā Tai. We've created these regulations that reduce the recreational fishing and commercial fishing. We've got a area control program that's locally managed and also working alongside the Otago University, and with a lot of help from Te Runanga o Ngaitahu. One of the highlights or lowlights was a trip to the Environment Court with Port Otago when they were deepening and dredging the Otago Harbour and dumping 7.2 million cubic metres of sediment and sand just offshore of our taiapiti. One of the other highlights, well, and anyway, that was no highlight, but it was a trip to the Environment Court and then again to the High Court to establish a more robust regime of monitoring. 2014, we had a paua reseeding program where hundreds of people, well, dozens of people, around 120, 130 people turned out to reseed the paua beds with about 400,000 or 500,000 pauas that were donated to us. And last year, we established a further rahui on Huirapa and the whole of our taiapiti in terms of the closure for the taking of pauas in the East Otago taiapiti, and a strengthening of some of the other regulations that we have, and also a rahui on the gathering of habitat-forming kelp. So, look, whānau, apart from a little technical difficulty there that I had, it's awesome, and nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Brendan. That was great. And I do like your strategy for dealing with technology when it doesn't go on. As some of you may have noticed, I couldn't unmute myself. So we've had one of those Zoom days. So our third speaker, Samara Nicholas, speaking to us, we hope, from Whananaki in Northland. Samara has achieved a lot in the conservation sector and has been driven to do so from a young age, ever since the spark was ignited while she was a student at Kamo High School and involved in the creation of a marine reserve in Whangarei Harbour. In 2002, she founded the Mountains to Sea Conservation Trust to educate young people about marine conservation through experiencing marine reserves, an organisation that has taken tens of thousands of school children snorkelling, hopefully igniting similar sparks in them. In 2018, Samara was made a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to marine conservation and education. One of Samara's EMR colleagues had told me, affectionately, that Samara can often be found on the shoreline on her hands and knees with her bum in the air, collecting micro molluscs. With 75% of New Zealand's molluscs less than 10 millimetres when fully grown, Samara has raised funds for EMR by selling these tiny shells in lockets. Now let's see, has Samara managed to get off the frozen...
Ko one kainga te maunga, ko te warahi te awa, ko whananaki taku kainga noho, ko Samara Nicholas aho. So my presentation is going to be around the educational benefits of marine reserves and marine conservation in New Zealand. And I thought I would start by just where it started for me was at Kamo High School. I was a year 13 student, and my geography teacher, took us snorkelling at this wonderful site called Motu Kāroa. And Motu Kāroa is in the Whangarei Harbour Marine Reserve. And the project started in 1990 actually as a geography project. There we go. And it's pretty unique because we were looking into 3 different ecological areas to be protected by one marine reserve. And it was a 16-year project. So I started as a student, and I haven't really ever left. And like Nick, I can't really talk about marine conservation until I also give tribute to some great heroes. These heroes, a lot of them I met back in these early days, and they continued to mentor me along my career pathway, and also have significantly influenced marine conservation in New Zealand. So that's Wade, Roger, Hone, and also Bill, and also Hone Taumanu is another one of my heroes. So after being so inspired at high school, I got together with some awesome people like Roger, Vince Kerr, and we established the Mountains to Sea Conservation Trust to enable us to provide a charitable umbrella for this really awesome marine education work. Because I got the idea basically for EMR while snorkeling with some Whananaki school students one time down at Goat Island, and seeing the look on their faces when they saw a big snapper swim by. So we created this program, Experiencing Marine Reserves, Te Kura Moana. And it is all about providing experiential marine education opportunities for young people, but also for their whānau. Te tiro ki te moana. EMR will take you down under. In a nutshell, that's what we do. We take people in the water. And we've now reached, we've taken over 62,000 Kiwis through our New Zealand Marine Reserves, and we've snorkeled with over 122,000. And our total reach for Mountains to Sea Conservation Trust is over 250,000 Kiwi. So we start in the classroom with an introduction to marine biodiversity, and then we move on to getting out and connecting young people and their whānau with what is actually living and the issues happening in their local marine environment. As Nick said, in Northland, and it's more quite common in Northland, we get the kinna barrens. So this is a very typical site in the northeastern area when we take kids snorkeling, and quite often they'll be like, oh, awesome, heaps of kinna. But when there's so many kinna like this, it doesn't often equate to good eating. So in order for us to kind of get everyone excited, we take them to a marine reserve, basically. That's the way we get them amping on what's going on in the marine environment. It's the way we get them thinking about issues in their local area. And we provide all that equipment and expertise to be able to enable that experience to foster the ethic of kaitiakitanga and looking after their local area. At school, libraries and playing fields are seen as essential amenities that we must have, and likewise, this is something Wade Doak passed on to me. He felt every New Zealander should have access to a wet library or marine reserve. And in my 20 years of experience in the marine education field, it's just very seldom that you can get up close and personal with snapper unless it's in a marine reserve. Nick's probably already talked about the rules for New Zealand marine reserves: no fishing of any kind, no disturbance, no feeding the fish. And he's probably mentioned how many there are. We now have 44, but there are some areas that are seriously lacking some marine protection, in particular our Northland region. And when you take into account how many no-take marine reserves there are around our mainland coastline, it's less than 1%. I'm very lucky to live quite close to Mimi Whangata and Roger and his work there. You can see that just the change, the dark space in 1950 was the kelp forest, which is now back in 2003 a lot less. So we've seen the benefits, and Nick's probably talked about that, the benefits of full protection. And like I said, we see a lot more when we go into a marine protected area compared to somewhere that is maybe only got partial protection. And it really blows you away when you go to places like Tawharanui and see a massive crayfish out walking about. And I think this poem really encaptures the kind of educational aspect of what we do, and that, too little seaweed, all fish hiding. This is a local area. People don't see much, even though we won't touch, keeping the distance away from us. How are we meant to learn? But in a marine reserve, the kids can observe things. They can observe a fully functioning ecosystem. We take kids from all around New Zealand every year. We get a representation of students from all the regions we work in and take them out to the Poor Knights Islands Marine Reserve. And I often get letters from kids talking about how they want to become marine reserves. I particularly like this quote because it's not just a marine biologist, he wants to be a marine reserve scientist. We've got also some really cool outcome stories. For example, one of our parents that came along on a trip with experiencing marine reserves went back to his hapu, and they have now established a rahui. And our organisation, Mountains to Sea Conservation Trust, is very much involved in helping to monitor that rahui, and we've been able to see a huge difference. And also, before we used to take kids from Kaitaia all the way down to Goat Island, which is 3 hours. Now we can take them to Maitai Bay because they can see snapper again. Just recently, the monitoring is showing really promising results. And like Roger said, the important thing is that it's no take and long term. So we can call it other names, but we're all about supporting the aspirations of iwi and hapu to achieve marine conservation in their communities. So also we go snorkeling in the rahui at Maunganui Bay in Deepwater Cove, which is so the Maitai Bay was a traditionally enforced rahui, whereas this one at Maunganui Bay is under Section 186. The important thing about our program is after they've had a great experience in the marine environment, they get out there and take action. That can be marine monitoring, presentations to the community, and generating groundswell. We also do community guided snorkel days where we get people basically community engagement in our marine reserves and also our special areas. And I love this quote. Are all these people lost and stupid? This was from Bill Ballantyne, and it's kind of about Goat Island, where how many people would flock to Goat Island. We're also seeing the same in Whangarei Harbour Marine Reserve. And, you know, these people, maybe it wouldn't hurt to replicate some of these areas. So we've established our non-profit franchise in many areas around New Zealand. We have an amazing team of coordinators, and I'm just going to run through some of the highlights of the different marine reserves in the different parts of New Zealand. So Whangarei Harbour Marine Reserve, completely different to a lot of other places. We have cool things like fringes and spotties and nudibranchs to look at. So it's a harbour environment. It's quite different, but it creates a fantastic educational focus. Also, it really is eyes on the water. We do have the marine pest Mediterranean fanworm in our harbour now. So by being able to involve the students in monitoring, we can pick up some of those, the distribution of those marine pests. Also in Auckland, one of the struggles we had was volunteers. This summer we had 110 active volunteers, and we hold amazing kayak days in these different marine reserves that are, like, for example, Holland Island, Motumanua, right next to the motorway there, but fantastic community engagement, and the Aucklanders can't get enough of it. In Gisborne, we work with Ngā Mahi Te Taio to deliver our EMR program, and this is where this awesome idea of the Tangaroa suite came from. The marine reserve is like a full cupboard that feeds the rest of the moana. That's a quote from Hone Taumanu, and the concept is that the mataitai is on the outside of the reserve. The reserve creates all the crayfish that move out, and then the local people benefit. In Taranaki, where this picture is actually from a really good day, it's not always like that. Also at Tapawai Marine Reserve down there, another great day. But generally they have to take all their kids up to Goat Island to be able to see big snapper again, just to be able to see a big fish in its natural ecosystem. Very inspirational and grounding for our people. We're also seeing down in Tasman Bay Guardians, this is in our Nelson Tasman region, at the Tonga Island and Huirangi Marine Reserves. Really awesome recovery there as well, especially Tonga Island with the crayfish. And Wellington, one of our most successful regions, they've got Kāti and Taputiranga Marine Reserve, be able to see paua really close to shore in Taputiranga, and be involved in really special celebrations. We really got to get that community behind these reserves. That's really, really important. And Otago, so we've been fortunate enough to snorkel in the East Otago Taiapuri, so that's our marine protected area in Otago. But we also took the students snorkeling at the Mole in Moana, and the kids down there were pretty keen to be able to see a marine reserve that would be accessible to them, somewhere with a wet library for them, somewhere that was close by. A lot of the marine reserves currently on the proposal for the extension of marine reserves and marine protection in this region, a lot of the no-take areas won't actually be very accessible to the general public. So I've just got a couple more slides here. So I think being able to have a place that was accessible for our students to be able to get that inspiration would be amazing. One of the last slides I was going to show is, it's not my day-to-day with technology, it's going to be the Kermadec Islands Marine Reserve, and being able to be part of going up there with Blake and on young Blake expeditions, being able to see sharks because they're the top predators and be able to snorkel with sharks. I mean, that was really, really amazing. And it was like a wet museum where everything is, there's so much endemic marine life. So I just think it's so important to have places where we can see the full ecosystem and share that with people. Also, you know, there are ways like in Whangarā with the Tangaroa suite of protection with the Marine Reserve and the Mātaitai. There was a generational review with that Marine Reserve. But I feel like things are just a bit slow at the moment, and it'd be really great for us to get out there and keep supporting our communities to make things happen, and perhaps get a bit more marine conservation happening in New Zealand, because there's some cool stuff, but there's not quite enough. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Samara. That is totally accurate. And also I like the fact that, Brendan, one of your projects took 9 months, and I would think we'd all like to know how we could achieve something like that. Now, we are going to go a tiny little bit over, so if you need to go away, obviously that's up to you, but I do think we need to have a couple of questions before the end. Great. So our first question is, and I'm not also naming the people who are asking the questions because this is going on YouTube, and none of you have given permission for your names to be used, so you know who you are. So do you know if the value to the fisheries of the reserve effect on snapper and rock lobster and kelp recovery has been calculated for New Zealand? This person's thinking about how to get at least some of the commercial fishing sector on side with systematic protection. Nick.
The value no, it hasn't been calculated. I understand there has been some work looking at how the reserve at Lee, the estimates could feed into the local economy and into the fishery for snapper. That's, I think, work in the pipeline. But yeah, I don't know if that's really, it's a good idea. I'm not sure if we can buy our way into getting support through protection. I think there's a big enough movement now recognising the need for it. And the fact that the current systems perhaps need to be improved. So yeah, good idea, and would be interesting to do.
Kia ora, Nick. Another question for you. Based on research needs and challenges, do you have any thoughts about how to better resource us to acquire data and monitor impacts in the coastal marine area? And are there any existing operators and assets in the marine environment able to be adapted to achieve better data use?
Oh, that's another challenging one. Can you just say the start? I missed the start of that.
Right. So do you know if the value to the fisheries of the reserve effect on snapper... Oh, no, sorry, that's the... sorry, that one's popped up again. Based on research needs and challenges, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how to better resource us to acquire data and monitor impacts in the coastal marine area. I think we'll just start with the one question.
Yeah, well, ironically, a lot of our research at University of Auckland over the last few years on rock lobsters has actually been funded by donors. So there's been relatively little government resource put into marine reserve monitoring, but I do understand that DOC has got an increased budget for marine reserve monitoring, and which is starting, hoping to get some more monitoring going over the next few years. But generally, a lot of the monitoring has been done on the sort of bit of a smell of an oily rag. But some of our work we've been doing lately has actually been funded by donors, such as tracking lobster movements in and around the marine reserves. So yeah, we just have to get creative in where we can find money. Yeah.
Brendan, we've got a question here for you. How can we bring about a national approach to what you're doing in a time frame that addresses the pressures of the issues, overfishing, sedimentation and climate change?
Yeah, well, I should say that Ngāi Tahu has a network of customary protected areas. I can't remember the exact figures now, but mātaitae, taiapuri and temporary closures. So I think working with communities, looking at it holistically rather than kind of siloing some of the issues. Yeah, I guess all I can do really is speak on behalf of the work that we do here. But there's always that invitation for people to come and have a look what's being achieved in East Otago, rather than us trying to tell people how to do things in their backyard. So I would extend an invite to any that do want to come and have a look at just what's happening down here. Got it.
I think we'd all like to take you up on that. Okay, so is there anything else our speakers would like to say before we close off for the day? Is there something you'd like to add to anything you've heard? No, it has been one of those days, most definitely. But do please join us next week for our 6th session, where we should have our Zoom issues under control. Our second panel discussion, which is kaitiakitanga o te moana, which will see Indigenous leaders from Aotearoa and around the world share their perspectives on ocean conservation. Our featured speakers are Associate Professor Kura Paul Burke, Marine Researcher from the University of Waikato, T.A. Sayers, Technical Advisor Motiti Rohi Moana Trust, and Sheridan Waitai, Ngāti Kuri Trust Board, and Jacqueline Blake from Te Tapuai o Rongokako Marine Reserve in Tairāwhiti, Gisborne, Ludovic Burns-Tuki from Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and Verna Wilson III from Alaska, who is a member of our Friends of the Earth. Although that session, you must realise, is not next Wednesday, but it will be held this coming Monday, June the 8th, which is World Oceans Day, although it is still at 3:30 p.m. New Zealand time, using the same Eventbrite booking system, and we'll run that day 15 minutes longer than usual to squeeze that little bit more in. I'm so sorry we didn't have time for more questions. I love the idea of a wet library, and even better, Samara, a wet museum. That's how, and I want wet encyclopedias everywhere. So thank you so much for joining us today. Do please email any thoughts or queries about the People's Choice webinar, and some of your questions that were going up in the Q&A, we will try and answer by email as well, and in the bottom of the YouTube when it's uploaded, because a lot of them were really important and we do want to get to them. So indeed, email anything you feel like saying to marine@doc.gov.nz. Ka kite anō te whānau, kia ora. And now Brendan will close with a karakia. Thanks, Brendan.
Kia tau, kia tātou katoa o te atawhai o tātou ariki ihu karaite me te aroha te atua me te whiwhina tahitanga ki te wairua tapu ake, 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 āmene. Kia ora.